Crack away.
Welcome everyone. My name is Sylvain Lézé from the Department of Aeronautics at Imperial College London, and this is the new episode of the podcast Turbulence at the Exascale. So for those not familiar with the podcast, we are trying to gather the view of the community regarding exascale computing with a particular focus on turbulent flow. So this podcast is part of the ExCALIBUR initiative here in the UK. This ExCALIBUR project is led by the Met Office, by the UK Atomic Energy Authority and the UK Research and Innovation. And its aim is to deliver research and innovative algorithm development to harness the power of exascale computing. And I'm leading the working group on turbulent flows, and this podcast is part of this ExCALIBUR initiative. It's also associated with the UK Turbulence Consortium. And today we have a slightly different episode for the podcast because I wanted to hear from women in HPC. I don't know if you are very active on Twitter, on internet, but there is a very famous Twitter account called Women in HPC, and I thought it would be a good idea to know more about this initiative. So today we have two guests who represent women in HPC. And my first guest is Cristin Merritt, who is doing cloud HPC programs for Alces Flight. And about 3 years ago, she became involved in Women in HPC, and she's a communication volunteer for social media and to cover the major events from Women in HPC. And my second guest is Andrea Townsend-Nicholson, who is a professor of bioscience in the Department of Structural and Molecular Biology at UCL in London. And Andrea is acting as a UCL representative for Women in HPC. And interestingly enough, she's also involved in the ExCALIBUR project, so she will tell us more about that. So good morning, Cristin, and good morning, Andrea.
Good morning.
Thanks, Sylvain.
Thank you very much for joining us today. And as I always said, without further talk from my side, we are going to crack on with my question. And I'm going to start with you, Cristin. So for those who don't know you, can you tell us more about yourself, where you're from, what you have studied and where, and how did you end up working for Alces Flight?
It's a long story, but I'll make it short. So I was originally born in the US, came to the UK in 2008 to follow my husband, who was a postdoctoral student at Oxford University. He ended up working on this little adenovirus that people might be familiar with now, known as COVID-19. And he actually is currently working on the Oxford vaccine program. So I'm very proud of him. So that's my little plug to my husband. I actually was a classicist. I studied classics at the University of Florida, but I've always been quite interested in tech back in the day when you had to walk down to a building to check your email. And I ended up in SAP, originally doing adult education and training for switching large enterprise systems. When I moved to the UK, I worked in a financial filing language called IXBRL and moving accountants from paper to doing cloud filing. And because I'd done so much work in cloud work, one of my colleagues, my former colleagues, recommended I talk to the people at Alces Flight who were working on a cloud adoption program. And they took a risk, they hired me. And I have been deep dive, submerged in HPC for almost the past 5 years. So that's how I came here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And the same question for you, Andrea.
So I'm also very similar to Cristin in that I'm North American, but I'm from the slightly northern version, so I'm Canadian. And I've had a more traditional academic route in terms of my education and the experience, but I've not really done it in typical places. So I did a bachelor's in Canada. I did a PhD in France, which was really interesting because as a researcher and an educator in the UK, I've actually been an overseas student studying in a language that wasn't my own. So I've got a great deal of empathy for people who are sort of moving around and trying to join communities. I went to Australia to do a postdoc, and then I came here to do a short postdoc and got a British Heart Foundation research fellowship. And then I got an academic appointment and I've worked my way through that. So like Cristin, not born here, came here, never left.
Very good. Thank you very much. And a follow-up question for you, Andrea. I will come back to you, Cristin, later. But what's the best thing about your current position, Andrea, at working at UCL? What do you really like about your academic life?
It's the richness of the community, because you have the most fantastic opportunities here, and there's such great people around. So I can go out for a coffee, chat with someone I've never met before, come back to my office with an idea I never would have thought of if I hadn't gone for that coffee. It's just really lovely to bump into such a high critical mass of such great people.
Great. And I have a similar question for you, Cristin. What do you really like about your current position, your current job?
Oh, I have the absolute best colleagues in the world. This particular past year has been really rough, and they've been there for me. Work with the best clients ever, who are willing to take risks and try new things, which is great. But I really have to say the most important part about my job is our two office dogs, which are Harley and Oscar. So I just wanted to give a shout out to them, because it is so great to have company meetings and see them just messing around in the background, I suppose.
We've
That's
been
very good.
lobbying for a departmental dog, but haven't got there yet. We
Yeah.
might get there. We might follow your lead on that.
Yeah.
So, Cristin, you said you were also always interested in tech, but how did you become like interested in particular in high performance computing?
It's so funny because so much of it is just like those weird circumstances. I thought that being an SAP and just doing like large enterprise change management was as nerdy as you could get, and it was like, no, we can go further. And when I came to Oxford and I needed to find new work, the IXRL initiative had come about, and it was again a very complex, large scale change of getting people to go from a system that they'd known, for what seems all eternity, paper, into filing in the cloud. And that little bit there is what started me with HPC, what started me talking with Alces. And as I got into the Alces technology, into HPC and how complicated and how the step through process works, and how working with different viewpoints can lead to big revolutionary changes, I was in. And it was the learning curve was very much like this, and I was climbing up the sides. But thankfully, I'd had Linux experience in my prior work, and I had some other stuff out there, so I kind of knew what I was getting into. But slowly but surely, especially the hardware side, I had very little experience, and understanding how it all has to work together to get a workflow happening was mind-blowing for me. So it was one of those things where you start one way and you think you're going one path and you completely end up in another.
Great, fantastic. And you, Andrea, I have a similar question. How did you become interested, and how are you using HPC for your daily research?
So I've always really liked technology for some reason. I don't understand why, and the computing bit of it. So I think my father brought home a DEC Rainbow when I was 10 and just dropped a book down of games in BASIC. And so we started playing with things like that. It wasn't really something that was possible in my field. I am interested in a family of receptors that sit on the surface of the cell. They were very difficult to characterize structurally because they were in a complex environment, but there were lots of early computational programs. Silicon Graphics was taking a look at images and trying to understand what these things might look like and make models of them, and an increasing amount of structural information was coming out. But it hadn't really got to the point until recently for things to become reliable and reproducible and giving results that converge with experimental findings. And once that happened, I was in. So I'd been looking at things from about 1991 and started doing things in earnest in 2013. So it took a while to get to that point. And the reason why it's so important to do that is because to have those things converge is so that you can interdigitate between something computational and experimental. And you can basically use computational resources to do a lot of the experiments that would have been inquiry experiments in a laboratory that would have been expensive in time, expensive in reagents, expensive in people. And you can do them computationally much more rapidly and then target precisely the experiments that you will do to confirm your findings. And they work very well together. But the HPC came about because that was the computational power that was needed to run the ensembles that gave you those kinds of reproducibility. So we're about 15 years behind the astrophysicists in embracing ensembles so that we can get repeats and error measures and understand the values that we generate and be able to use those to inform our experimental work. So in the past 4 years, I would say my lab has gone from being 98% experimental to 85 to 90% computational. And that's a really fast pivot, really fast. It's not that we don't do much experimental work, but we do very targeted things. And we've saved all that time that we would have been spending in the lab by using the compute.
Fantastic. Amazing. Thank you both. Right. So as I said in my introduction, we're here to talk about women in HPC. So I know it's going to be a difficult, not a difficult question, but a very general question. But Cristin, can you tell us more about women in HPC? What is women in HPC?
So the short of it, the little like tag that you see on the Twitter feed is equal representation in HPC. The longer of it really is a diverse and inclusive workforce in high performance computing. As you've introduced and as I am, the whole organization is volunteer led. There is like no paid board doing everything. Every workshop you see, every mentor program that gets launched, everything is completely led by volunteers, which is amazing. And yeah, like I said, we've got the mentorship program that works to help match women in their careers, any stage in their careers, by the way, with mentors. They've also got the large scale workshops. A lot of people who go to ISC and SC specifically will have seen stuff like that. There's also our chapters and affiliates program that got launched, I think 2 years ago, where basically it's the idea of going down into the local levels and making sure that people get that kind of one-to-one impact that, you know, once you're at a big conference, sometimes that spark sort of dwindles away. The coolest thing about being a volunteer for women in HPC is I have learned a lot about what it takes to move towards that idea of diverse and equal representation in the workforce. And I have, not to brag, but to brag, I suppose, I've run 3 marathons in my life. And I understand the difference between a sprint and a marathon. And getting that equal representation is a marathon, and it's a series of steps and commitment. And in a marathon, if you don't commit to the training, you're not going to finish. And for women in HPC, it's making the little steps. And so some examples, I wrote down some examples, was like making sure that anybody who's in a meeting tries to call on a broad mix of people. Don't try to just go to the same groups. Make sure you give credit where credit is due. I'm sitting here because there's 20 other people working their tails off down in Alces to make these things possible. And I appreciate them. There's also, you know, doing that mentoring. If you'd like to be part of that program, that should open up hopefully next month. Just lifting people up. For women, just take up space culturally, especially in the West. We've kind of been told to make ourselves small. I'm from the American South. That's a big problem. I have to deal with that a lot. Just be an example. And especially with the pandemic, the idea of this work-life balance has really gotten into a conversation with, especially with technical companies, and understanding that people have families, that have lives. And it's also wonderful to see that the work women in HPC is doing is impacting men's lives, because men have cultural stigmas they have to deal with as well. And we're trying to just break down those boundaries wherever we can.
Great, thank you very much. And Andrea, I'm going to ask you, what do you do? So you are volunteering for women in HPC, but what do you do for women in HPC?
So I have a slightly different role to Cristin's. We're both in a large Horizon 2020 funded Center of Excellence that's been going since 2016 and be renewed, called Comp Biomed, which is to develop a user community in computational biomedicine. And I'm the Comp Biomed lead for women in HPC. So I promote the WHPC activities, I support the mentoring, I actively ensure the inclusivity in access to HPC and training in its use. So all of the training that we do, we're looking to make sure that there's a representative demographic of trainers, as well as the people taking the courses. And it's probably not been very well appreciated by the HPC field. There aren't an awful lot of women in HPC. And the biomedical domain is doubly disadvantaged in HPC because there are few biomedical scientists who use it, even though as many as 60% of the field are women. So when we started with Comp Biomed, 10% of Archer was being used by biomedical scientists, and 9.8% of that was medical physics. So it's not the sorts of things of simulation and monolithic codes and coupled codes and ensembles and things that we think of now. It was just a very small part of the user community. So I use my role in Women in HPC to proactively redress those sorts of things and to find opportunities for people at all career stages to become involved in things and participate in things and just have a greater awareness of the organization and the fact that it can be facilitator and can help them do things that would be of benefit for them and broader users.
So just as a follow-up question, in your community, so you said you have about 60% of women, which is much, much higher than in a turbulence community where I think it's under 10% easily. But so you are saying that out of those 60%, not a lot are HPC users, or is it?
Not many people in the biomedical community are HPC users. Okay. And the proportion of those who are, I don't actually know. We should do a Women in HPC survey or something and just figure out exactly where we stand in terms of the statistics. But there aren't many biomedical users, which means that in a field that is managed to embrace diversity in terms of gender equivalence in appointments and roles and people in the community, they're not showing up on HPC, which is partly because the whole user community is less represented than that. Okay. And you'd need to dig into the statistics to find out the other bits of it that inform it.
Great. So Cristin, now I have a couple of questions for you. So obviously there is, well, we know that there's not a lot of women actively working in HPC. And what do you think needs to be done to encourage more women to participate in the HPC community and to start using HPC?
I think in general, there's so much research out there about the historical contribution of women, especially in computer sciences. There was a very long program, I think the BBC did, talking about basically like how the rise and the fall of women, especially in high performance computing, started to happen as things transitioned and changed. Kind of really going back to that idea of that marathon, I think that we as a community, and it's in me included, Andrea has taught me quite a bit about how to word and phrase things to be far more inclusive in how I talk when I do any proposals and things like that. We all need to make a step, take steps forward. And those for some people might be very small and some might be a lot bigger. We have really like for women to get more into technology in general and then to progress to things like supercomputing. We as a society just simply need to do stuff and be more open to encourage women, girls, to encourage everybody to really kind of make those steps forward. I have a little boy, I have a son, and he has a huge interest in robotics. And I constantly tell him, well, why don't you tell the girls you know at school about robotics, and why don't you work with that kind of stuff with them? And he goes, and you can tell it's already like kind of set in, but. And it's like, no, Miles, everybody is welcome into technology. I was blessed to have an engineer for a grandfather who was very welcoming to this person who I was a languages person, saying, well, languages and computer languages are kind of related to each other, and having those kind of relationships go forward is great. And I think that if everyone kind of takes a moment and chooses something that they could possibly do, even if it's like really tiny, such as going in and talking to somebody they know about working in tech, or doing something huge like mentoring programs and stuff like that, then that will bring it forward. I've seen it come a long way since I entered the SAP world 20 years ago. And yes, we still have further to go, but as long as we as a society make a conscious effort, we can change things.
Great. So in my community, which is engineering and more particular in fluid dynamics and turbulence, there's not a lot of women academics or researcher. So obviously there will be even less women doing HPC. So do you think we should target schools where there is already a bias, as opposed to wait a little bit later and when it's already too late? Because I really believe that we should work. We should do some training at a school level to let the girls know that doing tech is great and fun, and it's going to be nice.
And I actually encourage that. If that is the right thing. It's time, effort, and energy. In talking about transforming that, there are groups for women, girls who code, women who code, lots of stuff around tech and engineering and stuff like that. And if your choice or the choice of the UK Turbulence is to take that step, that's a brilliant step, because when you're in there and you're standing around and you're normalizing it and this is okay and everybody's doing it, it helps change that dynamic and that dialogue from this whole one thing for boys, one thing for girls, to, oh, actually this is sort of open for everybody, and oh my gosh, this is really interesting. And it's that kind of exposure that will bring more women up. And now it steps along the way too, because women, we get knocked down at every path, unfortunately. And if you're a woman of color, it can be even harder. And so it's just getting out there. And if UK Turbulence can do that, if you can do that, or if any of your team can, that's going to make a massive difference. And again, it's those small steps that just does it.
Great. And so I have two questions. First, if some people who are going to listen to the podcast are interested in joining Women in HPC, how we can do that? And also, if some people wants to contribute financially towards, the fellowship and the mentoring scheme, how this can be achieved? What's the best way to get involved with Women in HPC?
Well, the cool part is it's free. There's no fees. So you can go to womeninhpc.org and just sign up for membership. Now, I really want to be absolutely clear that this membership is for everybody. We do not progress unless we progress together. So we are very appreciative of our male allies, anyone from the LGBTQI community. Everyone is welcome. If you want to do anything in terms of contributions or sponsorships and things like that, I think it's info@womeninhpc.org. That goes to everyone who is part of the core communications and executive committee. So that means I will get a copy of that email as well. And we can hopefully hook up with you, make sure that you're doing, we can direct you to the right person, because we've got several volunteers who do lots of things.
Great. Thank you very much. So we go on the website basically, and all the information can be found.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Right, Andrea, now your turn. I wanted to ask you about, you talked already about that, about HPC. So I'm not going to ask you, you said that your community is a bit behind, but it's getting up to speed by using supercomputers. Now, we talk a lot about exascale computing, and I wanted to ask you, do you think your community and maybe your research group is ready for the transition to exascale computing, or you are still trying to catch up with everyone?
Well, it's an interesting question, because we are trying to bring ourselves up to speed, and we've done an awful lot of training for medical students and undergraduates to get people to have the concept of computational methodologies in their practice, in their chosen field, so that they're more familiar with it and use it more. And we've been really impressed by how readily these things are adopted. So any of the training that we've done in HPC, we have easily, of the ones that we know about who come back to us, everybody has gone on to do something additional with it, found additional opportunities. So people are keen and technically savvy, and I think they'll have no problem once they've got access to the appropriate resources, which is both training and access to the machines. It's quite difficult to get access to the machines if you're not in EPSRC, for example. EPSRC and MRC and BBSRC have different sorts of engagement about how you get onto these resources. And so for me, it was an absolute gift to be in a European consortium that had a center of excellence, that had facilities, HPC facilities as a part of it, both in the UK and in Europe, so that we could move around onto the different machines depending on what we needed. So we are ready to transition. We do, as you point out, need training to bridge the digital skills gap to give the community confidence and competence in the use of HPC. We also need to be able to identify what people are using and scale and port their codes onto petascale HPC so that they can then move on to exascale from there, because you can't, we're trying to create a pathway that goes from the desktop through to workstations, through to small clusters, through to petascale, through to exascale in earnest. And it's probably fair to point out that I don't know if anybody's ready for the exascale because we don't have the machines. So we don't have anything to test on them yet. And all of the scaling we're doing are, I'm not sure how many pre-exascale demonstrators there are. I think Comp Biomed's gotten up around 300 to 500,000 cores for scaling codes. But it's really hard to say to somebody, I want all of your machine for a day. So I'm going to try my scaling to make sure that this is ready for exascale. So there's some really interesting issues that are involved in that as well. So I think once we get the gap starting to be bridged, we do have codes that we are using. And in fact, one of them is a turbulence code. So one of the things that I'd like to do to help broaden the representation for the biomedical user community, and as part of my role in ExCALIBUR, is to make sure that codes that we have are included. And so Palabos, which is a parallel Latzman-Baltus solver, it looks at blood flow. It's basically turbulence, but in the human body and blood flow. So part of my role there in helping my community transition to exascale computing is going to be finding as many relevant things as possible that exist to put them forward, and to find as many things that could get to the stage that some of those examples are already at and get them developed. So it's a lot of chatting to people, a lot of training people, a lot of looking at other fields, like what does physics do? What does meteorology and climate do? What is the materials community doing? Are there things that are routine practice there that were developed 15, 20 years ago that we should be adapting and adopting?
Great. And I have a follow-up question. You mentioned briefly ExCALIBUR project. So I know you're involved in this project. So can you tell us more about your role and what you are doing for this ExCALIBUR initiative?
Okay, so as ExCALIBUR was being developed and the science case was being built for ExCALIBUR, I was having coffee outside of my office in a place where some of these discussions were taking place. And I was intrigued by it and saying, oh, well, we're doing this with medical students on HPC, we're doing that. And it suddenly became obvious that there was a whole strand that could be incorporated into this so that we covered all aspects of things that would be of relevance to exascale in the UK. And so I sit on the ExCALIBUR hardware and enabling software delivery board. And I am one of a number of experts who are there to make sure that all of our scientific needs are met by the program. And I'm paying particular attention to promoting and encouraging the adoption and support for the needs of the life and medical sciences. And I'm particularly keen, because we've been less represented in HPC, to make sure that as these machines are developed, their architecture will accommodate our users in life and medical sciences as well as other users. So this is really co-design and talking about sharing in the design of new machines and making sure that enabling software includes things like bringing people software on. The training that we do was with an open source program that was known, that worked well on desktops, but had never really been ported to HPC and used that way before. And so we have some experience in being able to port things across and coax people to use them. You sort of breadcrumb them with biscuits and bring people with you saying, you know, you can do this faster or you can do more volume. And it's particularly important because of the explosion of biomedical data. We are generating genome sequence data, imaging data, metabolite and biochemical assay data. I mean, the number of SARS-CoV-2 viral sequences alone, I think the UK is responsible for sequencing something like 80 or 90%, if I'm not wrong, of all of the genome sequences for SARS-CoV-2 in the world. So we are generating data at a ferocious pace, and we need to really help people understand how to tame their data, how to manage their data, and how to exploit it to its fullest capacity. And that involves being able to deal with things at scale, and exascale is the next scale until we get to the scale beyond that scale.
Very good. Thank you very much. And I have a question for you, Cristin. So you're not in the academic world, but still you are using cloud and HPC. And a few weeks ago, we had someone from Amazon Web Services, and because we are trying to encourage academics to use the cloud, and I was wondering, is using the cloud in your industries is something quite common, or this is still like a new practice? And I'm curious to know about that.
So Alces Flight was, so what we do, we integrate HPC systems. So I have, when I'm allowed to go to the office, we have a large warehouse where they're actually pulling together and putting together systems which they ship on site. I was hired specifically around 5 years ago to look at the cloud adoption. And so we've done a lot of HPC community R&D work. All of it's published, so at ISC, that sort of stuff. We do put out projects. We have open source an open source stack called Open Flight HPC, which looks at the idea of porting and building clusters which can move across different environments or platforms. So that's been there in the background for 5 years. And in the 5 years that I have been in the cloud adoption field, I've gone from this is not going to happen, this is not a thing, no one's going to do it, to being able to actually do project work with wonderful people such as Andrea, where again, she talks about, going outside and having coffee and things like that. I joined Comp Biomed for a let's learn about personalized medicine thing oh gosh, like 3 or 4 years ago. And we started experimenting with the idea of clusters that you could launch at one click off of cloud. Andrea was in that class. She wandered off, and like a couple of years later, our research had progressed to understanding how to build HPC stack environments that could move from hardware to cloud. And at that time, the pandemic hit, and we were able to launch a project for Comp Biomed called the Nucleus Cluster Environment to teach people. And that's the thing, is that cloud is starting to find its foothold. I think there was a lot of fear around cloud at first, especially a lot of people thought it was going to come in and like wipe stuff out, which is crazy. Cloud really is helping services expand. They're really doing it in 3 ways. There's like the idea of obfuscating the HPC, so basically running workloads that people don't even know it's HPC. That's really common in CFD. There's a lot of startup work that could potentially come from academia around that sort of thing. The other stuff that's coming out is project-based, so very defined goals, very time-limited, budget-sensitive. Education does really well here. So teaching people core HPC concepts without having to get into the hardware. I've found a lot of system administrators are really actually quite happy to have that little cloud cluster that sits there to train the people who are going to use the physical cluster, because it's that like stepping process, as Andrea alluded to in the move towards exascale, that brings people on and nobody feels overwhelmed at once, which is great. The other thing that cloud is showing a lot of promise for, and we did this at the University of Liverpool, is expansion of resources. They have a system that called Cloud Barkla. They modified it for GPU use and scaling to do some COVID-19 research on imaging. And that's where cloud is doing really well. They have an incredible system on site, but being able to reach out into cloud and do those things is what's really kind of making cloud really a part of the HPC solution and not really a competitor to. But that being said, there are 3 downsides that I can think of. Number one, despite what people say, it's still seemingly hard to purchase cloud. Academia especially has a way of doing things. And a lot of the platform providers, they're changing their mind, they're starting to work with and not against. There's also resellers and things like that people can do. Managing cloud is actually difficult as well, because you've got specialists like system administrators on site. They're used to a certain way of doing things. Cloud's a different way of doing things. I'm lucky enough to work for a company because we do integration, we understand management. We've been able to do this, and it's work, but it is work. And like anyone can attest, Andrea can attest, there is a lot of work that goes into setting up a management system, but once it's in place, it starts paying off right away. And the third thing is simply, we need to really, it's strangely related to women in HPC, change. cloud is change. There are different things cloud can do. There are things that we need to welcome cloud in for. It's definitely now at that point when, like with quantum and AI and machine learning, where people are actually, cloud is part of that discussion, but and people are more comfortable with that. But if you go into the older codes and things like that, they're not so comfortable with it. And we need to actually confront and address that kind of change and that transition. What's holding people back? And even though that's not really technical, it's actually more of a people and soft skill thing. I think it gets ignored a lot because it's something I don't know people want to really readily address. But I've seen huge leaps and bounds with cloud. I think it's going to continue to grow. I think that sites will decide how much or how little cloud that they use. Some sites may be fully cloud in the future, and we just need to be flexible to that. And thankfully, cloud offers that flexibility.
Great, thank you. That's very interesting, I guess. No, it's very interesting because, as you said, in academia, we are well. The use of the cloud is not yet common practice at all, at least in the turbulence community. So I think it's very interesting to see all the opportunities that can come with cloud computing. And I think people will slowly realize that the benefit of using the cloud for their applications. Right, I've one last question for both of you, and I'm going to start with you, Andrea. So we are talking a lot about exascale computing, but I wanted to ask you, where do you think we will be in maybe 15, 20 years in terms of high performance computing? And basically I'm asking, do you think it's going to be an incremental change? So we are going to have GPUs that are more powerful with less energy consumption, or you think we are going to see like a revolution of some sort, and we are going to have completely different hardware to deal with? What do you think will happen?
I think it's probably going to be a little bit of a mixed economy as more people start to move on to these systems and discover what works better for them. I mean, my understanding is that there are some real advantages with GPUs for certain aspects, but it's difficult in other ways to work with them. And so the offset between these things would need to be worked out. The trend of the future, as far as I can tell, and both Cristin and I have been particularly fortunate to be in the Comp Biomed program that's driving this, is the vision of creating a virtual human that can create a digital avatar for every person for use for their personal health and well-being, that integrates everything from the nucleotides of their DNA all the way up to the architecture of their skeleton and the way that it moves. So this integration of data from multiple scales and data from multiple forms is, I think, what we're going to be seeing. So we can do and build a lot of the bits of the virtual human now. But we can't integrate it into the whole. And one of the things that we can't do now on a time scale that's clinically relevant is the bit of it that I'm interested in working in, which is drug discovery and trying to identify how drug molecules interact with a receptor protein's molecules to be able to change its behavior, either to activate it if it's not working, or block it if it's working too much, or find something that works appropriately. So this is, I have not met a single person that I've talked to, whether it's when we went to the UK Parliament as part of Sense About Science's Evidence Week, or in all the open day talks that we've been doing, which I now appear to be asked to do on a regular basis. The virtual human is incredibly appealing to everybody. Everybody wants one. Nobody thinks it's a bad idea. Nobody wants to know anything other than, when can I have one? The concept that you could age it out with a particularly bad lifestyle practice or a good lifestyle practice, see what was happening, and then step it back and reset it and start again, really allows people to take control of their own lives. And one of the things that I've observed in my research and in my teaching is that very often people don't know what to do with something until they've had a chance to do something with it. So when we have people accessing AI, they get a better appreciation of it in the apps and things they're using. I think things like the virtual human will really change the way in which people start to do things with it. And we'll see things that we've not encountered before, which I think is going to reflect itself in novel engineering. I really do think, I am most interested to see not what the people I train do with the HPC in the way that I present it to them. I'm interested to see how they'll find a different thing to do with it. you know, what they'll apply it to, what they want to do with it, if they'll come back and say, I mean, we had a former student who actually contacted the EPCC and said that he'd been on our program and he wanted to do some molecular dynamics simulations, which was completely different to what we'd been doing. And could he still, excuse me, could he still use his old account? And we thought, okay, now we're getting somewhere.
Very good. Very good. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I have the same question for you, Cristin. Where do you think, well, maybe in the context of your company, where do you think you will be in 15, 20 years in terms of HPC?
Oh gosh, the thing is I thankfully being part of the Comp Biomed group has given me a real insight into where HPC should go in order to allow wonderful things such as personalized medicine to happen. Because I study cloud and because I study how people take on cloud, I hope that in 15 to 20 years, cloud and hardware together are allowing more access. And, you know, especially with the work that they want to do at Comp Biomed, is giving people the access to the data to be able to run the simulations that they need in order to get the outcomes quickly. Now, you know, obviously you've mentioned like the green technologies and things like that. I very much hope that alongside of all the work we're doing to expand the HPC footprint across the world and access, that there are people out there working for better ways to generate, you know, the right amount of power, because it's a lot of power in order to run these things. I can't watch Mission Impossible. I can't watch a lot of the superhero movies anymore because I'm like, there's just no way because of how things are going. But at the same time, for me, it's really exciting to think about the possibility of access to this technology that excites me the most. And I really hope that as cloud finds its foothold, as hardware develops and changes, that more people are suddenly looking at this idea of working in high performance computing as part of their work, whether it be in medicine or in the traditional fields like physics or mathematics.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your answer, both of you. Thank you very much for your inputs. And thank you very much for talking on behalf of women in HPC. I hope some of our readers will look into the website and try to find ways to participate to this wonderful initiative. And on a more personal level, I would like to wish you all the best for your jobs, research, and future projects. Great. Thank you very much, everyone. That's all for today. As usual, you can find the episodes on the UK Turbulence website. So it's UK Turbulence in Google. You will find it. And we also have a Twitter, UK Turbulence, where we will be posting all the links and the recording. So thank you very much again, Cristin. Thank you very much, Andrea. That was really nice talking to you today.
Thank you,
Thank
Sylvain.
you.
Real pleasure.
Yeah.
And see you all for a new episode very soon. Bye-bye.